apologize for one thing. We have been in Ephesians. We're still going to be in Ephesians, but if I know I don't think we have Bibles in here, but at 7 o'clock this morning, everything shifted, and we're going to be in Luke chapter 15, but it correlates to Ephesians chapter 1, and because it has to do with love, and you can't go wrong with love, right? So last week we talked about there's this priority of the Father. And when you get into Ephesians, you can't help but notice this separation in these verses from verse 3 through 14. There's these separations that happen. Like verses 3 through 6 are all about the Father. Verses 7 through 11 are all about the Son. And verses 12 through 14 are all about the Spirit. So you see this Trinitarian layout that Paul has in the book of Ephesians. But as you go through these verses 3 through 14, you see that there's only one subject, and the main subject, or the subject of every main verb in these verses is always He or the Father. It always points back to the Father. Everything that's going on in these verses from 3 to 14 in Ephesians chapter 1 is pointing back to the Father. And last week we talked about this priority, and the priority of the Father is that you would know Him. That's everything that Jesus shows up on the scene, and everything. You go through John's gospel and everything. I think John calls Jesus the Son of God like over 100 times. And Jesus is always pointing, when He says the Son of God, it's pointing to the Father. And it is the absolute, no doubt, that the priority of the Father is that you would know Him. That's why Jesus came. He wanted you to know, He wants us to know who He is and everything that He is. And as we've been going through this in Ephesians, we started back in Numbers chapter 6. We started with the high priestly blessing, and we've arrived here in Ephesians chapter 1 because God is the blessed God, is what it says in Ephesians 1 verse 3. It says, God is the blessed God. It's not a verb, it's an adjective, it's describing the person of God. He's just this blessed God, and He can't help to be who He is. So what does the blessed God do? Because He can't help but be who He is, He just blesses. Because He can't do anything else. Because He is the blessed God. And everything that pours out of the Father is just a blessing, and that's who He is. And it's not just that. He goes on in these verses 3 through 14, and we see the word in Him. And Jesus is the in Him. Every blessing, everything that God has done is in the person of Jesus. That's why I say I'm big on getting people, impressing them to get into Jesus. Like everything that God has for you in your life is found in Jesus. You won't find it anywhere else. You won't find it in sports. You won't find it in cars. You won't find it in relationships here on earth. The only thing that you will find that is satisfaction to the soul is found in the person of Jesus. And the priority of the Father is that you would know who He is, and this is exactly why Jesus came. And that's what we talked about that last week. And I'm not sure I really did a good job on that. We talked about in Philippians a little bit. We talked about this, and I can tell you how I arrived at the point of what I said last week. And the thing is that Jesus was born a man. He was born a man. He had two natures. He had the nature of man and the nature of God because He was the God-man. He couldn't help but be who He was. And who is God? We just learned who God is, right? God is love. So Jesus could not give up love. He couldn't give it up. He was birthed in a world, and He was the representation of the Father, and because He is love, that's who Jesus was. But yet, this love was clothed with humanity. We saw Jesus, we saw the Father through Jesus because He was clothed with humanity. And He had these two natures. He had the nature of God and the nature of man. In Luke chapter 5, verse 52, or Luke 2:52, and Jesus is the example that we have for what a relationship looks with the Father. So in Luke 2:52, it says that Jesus grew or increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So Jesus, listen, Jesus grew or increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. And I know sometimes we think, and I think it's pretty easy to do, we see Jesus as the Superman, but really, what if Jesus was the Clark Kent instead of the Superman? What if Jesus set aside everything that gave him an advantage, which would be the Superman idea, and clothed himself with Clark Kent? And not as Clark Kent pretended to not have power. What if Jesus, we can go to Philippians chapter 2. This is where I brought this from last week. We didn't go through these passages because I didn't want to open up a can of worms. But after I left, I thought I should have opened the can of worms because they probably think I'm crazy. Because in Ephesians, this passage, it says, who though he was in the form of man, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing. Or what it says is that he was God, and he didn't hang on to it, grasp it, hold it like he had to, but he emptied himself. What did he empty himself of? He couldn't empty himself of his divine nature, which is love, right? But what else does God have? He's got all of these omnis. He knows everything. He sees everything. He's all-powerful. He left all of that. He laid it aside and became a man, made himself nothing by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Next verse. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. So the Bible scholars have a term. This is called the kenosis passage. Kenosis means to empty yourself. It says that he did not grasp, he did not hang on to everything. Jesus put himself at a place where he had no advantage. Well, you know why Jesus did what he did? He did what he did because he had an advantage. So last week, what I was trying to say is Jesus discovered everything like we discover everything, and that's an intimate relationship with God himself. I'm no different than you. You're no different than me. This is my press. This is my passion. This is my thing to get people into the person of Jesus and discover who he's created you, who he's made you to be, because you're so individual. He has got this seat he's created, he's made just for you. Only you have your fingerprints. Only you have your DNA. No one else has it. And he's created a spot for you to sit in. Jesus lived out the Messiah because he was the Messiah. That was the seat he had created before the foundation of the world. But in that Messiahship, it was the priority of God that through the Messiah, everyone would come to know who the Father is. There's an imparted righteousness, an imputed righteousness. I understand. Those are scholarly theological terms. He came to forgive sin, but he didn't just come to forgive sin. He came to forgive sin because sin separates us from God. And once the sin has been forgiven, then the intimacy of relationships can begin. And that is the journey we discussed last week about the priority of what God the Father is doing through the person of Jesus. And this is where what Paul is trying to describe in Ephesians chapter 1. What did the Father do, this blessed God? What did this blessed God do in order to get us to a place that he could have an intimate relationship with us? Does that make sense this morning? Is there anything unclear that from last week? Tell me afterwards. That you want to press back on. But listen, if Jesus set aside, he had no advantage, but he lived a life of intimacy with the Father. An empowering life by the Spirit and an intimacy with the Father. And we see this in Ephesians, this blessed God who chose us before the foundation of the world. So last week we talked about this priority. This week I want to talk about purpose. And it's interesting in the Ephesian passages, and I know we don't have all this because I'm trying to get to Luke 15 and we're going to run out of time, and then we'll just pick up next week. But it says 3 times in the Ephesians 3 through 14 that there was a purpose of God's will. There was a purpose of God's will. And if you search this word purpose, if you search the word purpose, you're going to find also that this Greek term is also used for the word pleasure. If you read the NIV version will say, instead of the purpose of God's will, it would say the pleasure. It's the pleasure of God. Everything, every blessing that God is pouring out, it's for His pleasure. He wants you to know Jesus because it's His pleasure. He can't help it. He just wants you to know who He is through the person of Jesus. But the point I want to get to today is this. The purpose of God is birthed in the desire that He has within His heart. I want to tell you a story about what I did one year on vacation. I worked for Nissan, and we had 2 weeks of vacation every summer. And recently I had rear-ended someone in my cherished 1991 Mustang GT 5.0 convertible. And I got some insurance money. I bought the car back and had a buddy had a 1988 Fox body Mustang. I know, you don't care about that. But anyways, this car, it had everything except for the convertible and the nice paint job. It had this motor that had been built by this performance shop. It had everything. It had the right rear end, had the right drive shaft, had the right, everything had been done to the motor and all of the drivetrain. So every night at work, for weeks, I thought about that car. Then I just thought about, I'm going to get this car. I'm going to buy it with this money, with this insurance money. I've got 2 weeks off. You know what I'm going to do with that 2 weeks off? I'm going to take all the parts out of this car, and I'm going to move it over to this car, and it's going to be great. And you know what? I had a family at home. You know what? That never seemed to enter my mind. I only thought about the car. And see, it was my good pleasure. It was the purpose of everything that I had. On my 2 weeks off, I was going to swap all of the parts from one car to the other. How selfish. The only 2 weeks off, and we worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, never home, worked night shifts, so I slept all the time. But on that 2 weeks off, you know what I did? You know, because the desire of my heart, the thing inside that pressed me to do what it was that I wanted to do was going to fix the car. But think about the purpose and the pleasure of God is all wrapped up in the person of Jesus. Everything that God did from the foundation of the world, everything that's happened from the very beginning, God had one thought. He had one thought, and it was Jesus. And you say, well, that doesn't sound right. But what if every blessing comes through Jesus? See, in the verses that we're in, I'm going to read these from Ephesians. I'm not sure if I have these. I said the message has changed, so a lot of things in the PowerPoint might not be right. But these are the verses that we're in Ephesians. In love, He predestined us for the adoption to Himself as sons. What if God's purpose, what if the pleasure of His heart, everything that He did, He predestined us for adoption to Himself as sons? You know, those days on the assembly line, on the nights that I worked and worked and worked, and all I could think about is that car. What tool am I going to need to swap everything over? Where am I going to do this? Am I going to need a tent? How it's going to be hot out there? It's in the middle of July. You know, do I have the engine lift? Oh, hey, buddy, I need to borrow your engine lift. Can I borrow your engine lift for a week because I need it so I can swap this out? I made all of these plans, and I did everything driving from the purpose of my heart, which was this car. And here's God saying, before the foundation of the world, He predestined us for the adoption of sons. That everything that the Father thought, everything that entered to His heart, everything that He did was that He would adopt us and make us His children. And Paul uses this language of adoption because he's speaking to a church in Ephesus, which is a Roman colony. And it's not just a Roman colony, but Ephesus happened to be the capital of Rome in Asia. And we'll talk about this next week. Hang on to that. But that's a big deal for them. But I wanted to go back in Luke chapter 15. And I wanted to talk just a minute about the prodigal. So if God's plan or purposes are driven from the desire of His heart, and His heart is love, and Jesus is the embodiment of God, the embodiment of love, and Jesus shows up in the midst of this religious culture and religious people, and they don't know what to do with Him. He is totally off base with their whole system. And this is where we get to in Luke. But all priority for Jesus, all priority of the Father is completely different. You get into Luke 15, and Luke 15 is all about the three things that are lost. You're probably familiar with those. You've heard this, the lost sheep, right? The lost coin, and then there's the lost son. We're all familiar with the prodigal son story, right? The prodigal son, many have heard that. But I want to go back just for a second into Luke 14, because Luke sets this up further back. He says in Luke 14:25, he says that large crowds were traveling with Jesus. And turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even his own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. It's interesting. There's a large crowd following Jesus, and he turns and says something so, we'll just call it astonishing. That was the word in Sunday school. It's astonishing. He's got this huge ministry, and he turns to the crowd to create something in them. And what happens is you go down to verse 34, and it says, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Luke uses this statement 3 times within his gospel. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. You know, the thing about love is, I think everybody has a deep desire birthed in their hearts to be loved. You know, Disney has triumphed on that love stories, and you see it, but yet you hold out. Everyone holds out within their heart the idea of this true love, that God has somehow put something in us to desire this love. However, when Jesus tells of God's love in the story of the prodigal, it kind of shifts. It changes. So in Luke 15, verse 11 now, I'm sorry, I'm probably making it hard back there. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. What Luke is doing, he's taking the first two parables that he's told about the sheep and the coin, all right? And he's taking the thought, the premise, or the concept from that, and he's interweaving it into this last parable, which is the parable of the prodigal, which we all know. And I know that we've been brought up thinking prodigal, what is, the prodigal, it's all about wasting, and it's all about, throwing everything away, because that's what this boy did. But what if the word prodigal, this is the definition of prodigal. You can put it up, I think it's in there. Having or giving on a lavish scale. That's the definition of prodigal. I'm going to tell you who the prodigal is. It's not the son. It's the father. The prodigal is not the son. It's the father. Jesus is not talking about the son. He's talking about the father. He's saying, look, there's something lost. Listen, all right, let's pretend for a minute we're all Jewish men, right? Let's remember we're all Jewish men. We live in a man culture. It's an honor-shame culture. We live by honor. You don't live by shame. There will be nothing shameful happen in our house because we are the men of the house. Are we all there? We're all Jewish men. 20 to 50, and we're Jewish men. Jesus is speaking to a group of Jewish men. He's directly telling this parable to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And he has this story of this son who comes to his dad and says, Dad, I want my inheritance right now. What? For a Jewish man, this is crazy. First strike. See, this is not about the prodigal son, it's about the prodigal father. The father who has given in a very lavish way. So the young man, he gets his money. And what does he do? He heads off. Everyone knows the story. He heads off to a distant land is what it says. And what does he do there? He squanders all of the money. He wastes it all, right? It even goes on within the story, and we don't have time, but it says that he hired himself out as a hired servant. Basically what he did, and this is in the text, this is what it says in the original language, he sold his birthright. He sold his Jewish heritage. He sold everything that he was. Every Jewish man, Pharisee, and law teacher that was standing there, he knew exactly what Jesus was saying. Strike number 2. No Jewish man would his son would ever come to him and demand him his money. No Jewish man would ever look at anyone and sell their birthright. Don't you know who you are, boy? And then number 3. The boy is eating pig's food, and he comes to his senses, and he says, wow, the hired servants have it better at my dad's house. And the boy goes back. And it says that, but while he was still a long way off, this is verse 20, it says, while he was a long way off, Donna, you can tell Ronnie this is his word, but is there. But while he was a long way off, his father saw him coming. Do you know what that word long way off? This is the great part about this. It says that not long after the younger son got his inheritance and he set off for a distant country, right? This is in verse 13. So the young boy, the prodigal son, as we've always called him, got his inheritance. He set off for a distant country, right? He went off to a different country. Well, when you go to verse number 20, it says, but while he was still a long way off, but still while he was in a distant country, same word in the original language. You see, the son was there, no telling what he was doing, what was going on. The father could only imagine. He has no idea. Yet the father, the whole time, loved the son, saw the son, had compassion on the son. Strike number 3 in the eyes of the Jewish men. You mean this boy who you gave all your money to, you're going to show him compassion when he comes home? Don't you have any honor, man? What is wrong with you? See, Jesus is the shock and awe of this story to these Jewish men. And Jesus is trying to portray the love of the Father. He's saying, don't you know that if there's a sheep lost, he would go get it? And all the Jewish men are saying, yeah, we'll go get a lost sheep. And don't you know if your wife loses a coin that she'll sweep the house when she'll find it? Yes, that's a very good woman. But here's the prodigal son who comes in your face and takes your money and then goes and squanders it all and then comes back, and you're going to have compassion on him? And Jesus is like, yes, because he's a God of love. This is who the Father is. See, in love, he predestined us for the adoption to himself as sons. That before the foundation of the world, the Lamb was slain. That he's now given us a spirit of adoption and not of fear, it says in Galatians. That we can cry out, Abba, Father. See, we're no longer in a place where we can't have someone give us protection and provision and direction. See, because the priority of the Father was that you would know him, and the whole purpose and the pleasure of his will is that he would guide you and lead you and take care of you and be everything that you needed him to be. Just as it is for the young man who wasted everything, and yet the Father was there with open arms. And you can continue reading. There's another son in that story. It's the self-righteous son. But Paul in Ephesians is telling us about this blessed God. And because this blessed God can do nothing less than bless, he provided us a way to become sons and daughters of the Most High. Because that's the passion of his heart. He's got one purpose, and the pleasure of his heart is to fill his kingdom with sons and daughters. And it's in Jesus that we find that. So we're going to go in the next couple of weeks and we're going to talk about that. But I just felt very compelled to share the prodigal. There was a man who had 2 sons. And one of them came home and was never the same. And the other one grew up in the house, and he never got it, as far as we know. God is so good. He is so good. You talk about immediately. God has called his sons and daughters to be a revelation of who he is to a world that's lost and dying and going to hell. Whether you're at the grocery store, this is nothing. Standing right here is just a moment of time. This is just one small moment. There's 23 other hours in the day. He's called us to be sons and daughters. One last thing. In the context of the Jewish people, if you were a son of daughter, you mirrored who the Father was. When you see my son, you'd say, there's Mike. Because my son is the mirror image of who I am. We're sons and daughters. We are that love. We are the verses of 1 Corinthians. Don't put Jesus' name in there. Put your name in there. Because God in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 3 says that he has given us everything for life and godliness. He has given us His divine nature. Do you know what His divine nature is? Love. Woo! Man, let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much. Father, thank you so much that you revealed yourself to us. Thank you for your word, Lord, that's spirit and it's truth. Thank you how it grips the soul. And Lord, I want so much to understand the depths of what it means to be your son. And I pray that everyone here, that we come to the depths of knowledge of who you are, because it will be we will reflect that because we belong to you. It says that you said that my people are destroyed because of the lack of knowledge. It's the lack of knowledge of who you are, Jesus. So I pray, grow us in ways that we can't grow ourselves. Birth something in us that is kingdom and not worldly. Thank you for everything that you've done to pull us into your family. That it's your desire to grow the kingdom. And the gates of hell will not prevail.